This week on FX Guide TV.
We're in Stuttgart, Germany, where we get to sit down with industry legend Joe Letteri to discuss the amazing work of Weta and look at the flavour of the month at FMX this year, VR.
This and more coming up next.
Hello, I'm Angie and welcome to FX Guide TV. We like to cover a huge variety of material here at FX Guide, and that is only possible due to the great support of our FX Guide Insider members. If you would like to support our work and the show, as so many people have generously done, then go to fxguide.com and click on the FX Guide Insider button. All right, now over to Mike for this week's show.
Welcome to FX Guide TV. I'm Mike Seymour. This week we're at FMX in Germany, where we're going to be looking at a bunch of amazing stuff. FMX is a really terrific conference and we've been covering it for some time here at FX Guide. But I've got to tell you, the view here in Germany is pretty darn good. Okay, so now we are here at FMX, and in fact, normally it's John that comes, not me, but I was invited to because I was part of the presentation of the Digital Humans afternoon session, which included speakers from Weta, from University of Auckland, amazing research from ICT, and actually Chaos Group presenting the Wiki Human, the Digital Human League stuff, which of course we'll be covering separately. It's a really, really great conference, and I guess the theme here is VR. We've just had a ton of stuff revolving around VR, AR, or as they like to call it, MR. They like me to not call it that. Not augmented reality, but mixed reality. The difference being that augmented reality is meant to be like Google Glass, where there's just a screen that sits, that moves with my head, but pays no attention to world coordinates. MR, by comparison, is the Magic Leap, the stuff that we're seeing from HoloGlass from Microsoft, where in fact, if I see a surface and put a digital chessboard on the surface, it stays on the surface as I move around, and it allows my head. And I have to say, we've had some amazing stuff here, including this art piece. So one of the first interviews is in fact one of those VR pieces that I wanted to talk to you about. One of the big problems with VR and one of the big research areas, as we've already discussed in our course Inside FX PhD on VR, is the idea of light fields. It's just a really hot topic. It's sort of held up as the kind of, I don't know, the golden ring to be able to grab, because it gives us the ability to move our head and have head tracking inside a space. Now, the only way to do that right now is to have a fully rendered space. You fully render the space in real time, and so as I move my head, it renders a different position on the world. Completely possible, and the Oculus Rift and the DK2 do that, but it's limited by how fast I can render the world. If I have a render that drops out of real time, it's not going to work. I need to be rendering at a very high frame rate and updating in stereo what I'm seeing. So a game engine can do it, but it's, at the higher end of what's absolutely possible. The second I go to a non-real-time render, or for that matter film it in live action, the problem now is it's great and I get really terrific results, but you can no longer have the head tracking, because of course if I've pre-rendered the shot, how does it adjust for the fact that I'm moving my head left and right? It seemed like this was two things that were completely separate, and the only way to get to the other side was some kind of light field technology, which is at the very edge of the kind of research that's being done. But interestingly, we found a group here who was presenting a pre-rendered version of a VR experience, but it still allowed me to use my head movement and head tracking and see around. In other words, have parallax inside the view, but by the same token have the advantage of a pre-rendered, fully Arnold Mayer pipeline. Seems impossible, doesn't it? Well, I sat down with the developers to talk about it. Tristan, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. I was absolutely fascinated to see your VR solution, because the thing that I loved about the stuff from Oculus Rift is that I could move my head because it had head tracking. But by the same token, unless you've got an incredibly high-end renderer with a totally latest graphics card, your ability to actually render in real time and produce very impressive graphics is pretty limited. Your solution bridges both worlds, the world of pre-rendering, and still allows me to do head tracking, which seems like it's impossible. How'd you pull it off?
I can tell you we're not using light fields, which is another way to try to do it, but which is not mature right now. But yes, actually, we pulled up a system which allows us to have pre-rendered image with interactive parallax or positional tracking, which is really actually the key in virtual reality, is being able to move your head around. And actually just rotating your head gives you some parallax because your eyes are not positioned actually on the same axis as your head. So when you're rotating your head, actually your eyes are moving. And so if you don't have any parallax, like in standard 360 movies, then your head, well, your brain actually feels that something wrong with the image you're seeing, that you're not really inside that VR world. And so we have that working, but with pre-rendered, or even we could do it even with pre-recorded movies, even if we don't have a camera right now for the system, but the file format and the viewer itself is completely ready to have live action content as well.
Okay, now when I'm in the system and I've used it and it's magnificent, there's a kind of a box, if you like, an area upon which I can sensibly move. And for me, I had to try to get out of that. I mean, I would have to stand up or move because I could do quite a lot of actual head movement. But is there some kind of sense of how big that is around a person? Is it like a foot either side, or is it more in virtual space so it doesn't map to the real world?
No, it maps to the real world actually. Well, it maps to the real world because your tracking actually, your real tracking of your head is actually mimicked into the virtual world. So it's a virtual and real world box you have around you. We call this actually the zone of view, because with our system, instead of having just one point of view from which you're taking your movie, we're taking our movie from a zone of view, which is right now more or less equivalent to 1 meter to 1 meter to half a meter. So like 3 foot, 3 foot, 1 foot and a half. And it's actually linked, well, it's a kind of trade-off we have between the quantity of information we have to carry on to be able to give you an image from inside a zone of view and the latitude of your head movement. If the zone of view were infinite, you will be back in a way in virtual reality, and we wouldn't be able to pre-render everything. So it's a trade-off, and we found that this size of the zone of view is a good size because you can actually be sitting and bending quite a lot from a fixed sit position. So as a spectator, as a viewer, it's a good zone of view. And our system is really aimed at immersive movies. So like a real movie, you're not controlling really where the camera is, you're not controlling the action around you, you're a viewer of a movie, but with this little latitude of this zone of view, you have the experience of being inside, like present inside the movie.
Yeah, so I've got the stereo effects, I've got the head movement and flexibility, and that extends to the fact that I was on a balcony at one point, I kind of leant over and looked down, which is all terrific. So but that's I guess only part of what makes it impressive. What really makes it impressive for me is that the assets that you're generating for this aren't just stills, but they're moving clips. And not only that, they're moving clips, in this case, rendered with Arnold. So they're of the kind of quality we expect from a Mayer-Arnold pipeline. And that's exceptionally important to this, because if somebody's sort of looking at this now, it isn't throw everything away that they know to sort of specially produce some special thing. It's really something that fits into a pipeline, doesn't it?
Absolutely. That's the whole trick, is that it fits in a completely regular pipeline. Right now we're using Maya and Arnold, and it's really like a different rendering at the very end of the pipeline, which means that actually the modeling, the rigging, the animation, the lighting, the shading, the lighting, everything is exactly the same as a standard 3D movie or VFX movie. It's just that the very end of the process, we're messing up with the camera with our plugin, and we're messing up with the file output to output our own file format. But so all the pipeline for a VFX company is the same. So it also means that all the assets they created for other commercials or movie or whatever could be just taken as is and re-rendered with our system to bring an immersive experience out of it.
Okay, so let's say I'm a major post house somewhere in London or Soho, whatever, and I want to do this. I could approach you and we could either work with you or license the stuff to produce it. Now I produce it for my client. I've got my big car commercial. I repurpose my assets. Great. What then happens? Does somebody have access to the player for free, or like is it only for special installations?
No, yeah, well, The player will be for free, that's the idea, and what we charge will be the creation of the content for the system, because our client will need actually to spread out the player as much as they want, so we don't make a charge for the player. And as for the installation itself, well, right now we still need a good computer. It's not like a 5,000 computer, but you still need a good computer to make it work. So right now the installation itself, let's say the player hardware or the hardware around the player, is better to control it for the moment. So it's better that you know that it's the good graphic card with the good CPU and so on. It's not really fancy, but it's...
Yeah, I think that's an important point. Like, you're talking about a good gaming PC, but you're not talking about a prototype Titan X card that is only available to those people that happen to be best friends with NVIDIA.
No, we're talking about like 700 GTX or 900 GTX cards.
Right.
And we're talking about i7 processors with latest generation motherboards, that's it. But still, you need to have those to make it run fluently, because we really believe that's what's really important, is that you don't have to have any stutter, it has to be fixed at a good frame rate, so it's very important for everyone to have a good experience. So right now we tend to try to control the hardware for the moment and not let it out for everyone to try on any hardware.
Right. So the system that I was looking at was obviously the DK2 setup, which a PC. What was the kind of frame rate that you were rendering at, and then I was viewing at?
Okay, so there are two kinds of frame rate with our system. You have the frame rate of the movie itself, which we're based in Europe, so it's 25 frames per second, and you have the frame rate of the DK2 for the display itself, which is at 75 Hz because it's the standard frame rate of the DK2. We already made it work at over 90, so it's ready for higher frame rate headset.
So the file that I render is presumably pretty big, because the whole point of it is I'm pre-rendering a bunch of possibilities, and then presumably from this big file that I make, the player in real time extracts out my head positional view on that data.
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, the file size is quite huge for the moment. Well, let's say it's big, it's manageable, but it's big. It's like 100 megabytes per frame, uncompressed. But we already have compression scheme that works very well. The problem, we're actually making it work to decompress it real time. That's the problem I had right now. It's not impossible to solve, but that's what we're talking about.
I also got to talk to Felix and Paul, the VR company behind such things as the Cirque du Soleil stuff, and most interestingly, the new Jurassic World piece, which is a real immersion, quiet piece. I have to say, I like that piece a lot. Probably my favorite of theirs is the piece they did for The Wild, which is another great VR experience. And they were here presenting, as well as being on several panels. Thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
So could you explain to me the Felix and Paul business model? Like, you're not sort of a gun for hire so much as a production company, as I understand?
Yeah, so we are a creation technology studio. So we do both. We're really we're developing our cameras to allow ourselves to create the content that we want to create.
So you've done some really creative pieces like the Wild piece. I really liked that, which were not only a VR experience, but they were very dependent on where I was looking. I didn't realize it when I first watched the piece, but depending where I looked, I got different plays. Do you come up with the ideas of this stuff? Did you get a very open brief, or do you work to a more detailed? Yeah,
no, it was a pretty open. Basically, we got a call from the folks at Fox, and they told us they wanted to make a virtual reality companion piece to Wild. They invited us to the studio, showed us a work in progress of the film, and from there we started thinking different ways we could do this. What we wanted to do is really create something that you could not have created as a film, obviously. We wanted to take the world, the characters, and bring all of this somewhere that just could not have been explored in cinematic form, that was really optimized for virtual reality. So they basically gave us carte blanche, and we developed it. We bounced it back and forth a few times, and we of course wanted to make sure that the director and the actors were all comfortable with what we were proposing, and yeah.
So you've done some very impactful pieces. I mean, the Cirque du Soleil piece that I mentioned before is very impactful, and you're looking up and experiencing stuff. But if I was to say that you had a bit of a signature style, it's to not play for a sight gag or a fast kind of thing in your face. I mean, I think that's particularly the case with the new Lost World piece. It's very much not what I would have necessarily expected, which would be a dinosaur snapping at my face. It's more of an experience.
What 3D was being used for in the theaters was very much this sort of sight gag in your face. Really, since the second wave of 3D that came along with Avatar, there's probably been a handful of films that really pushed the medium, to interesting places in my view. And so with VR, we took a lot of this exploration of really creating, considering the viewer as a part of the experience is a big part of it. And it's a fragile thing, it's very, everyone's talking about presence in virtual reality, but it's a very fragile thing. It's not an automatic thing that happens when you start a 360-degree camera and all of a sudden you're like, oh, this will teleport the viewer here. No, that there's a lot of factors that contribute to the solidity and the credibility of an environment. And a lot of the times, if something is too intense or it doesn't respect certain principles, it becomes less intense because you stop believing in it, or you feel like you should be able to react, but you can't. You can't get up and run when the dino snaps at you, right? So don't make the dino snap at you, and then you won't want to run, and then you'll feel like you're really there even more.
So we've discussed a couple of film trailer pieces and very theatrical pieces, but I've also experienced sitting and having dinner with a Mongolian family on a place I'm never likely to get to. That had a very much a documentary feel to it. Yeah. Is there any hope to do some kind of more documentary style work or longer form?
Well, Herders, the piece you're referring to, was actually the first piece in a series. So we're doing the second part right now in Kenya. I actually just flew in and I'm flying back to Kenya to do a piece with the Maasai. So this is going to be a series on nomadic cultures around the world. And so yes, the answer is we're definitely doing that.
So you don't really have one, I mean, you have your own camera rig, but you don't have like one rig because it's been evolving as I understand it. Yeah. Is that right?
Yeah, so we ultimately have the most current version of the rig is the one that we use. It's very hard to go back once you've solved technical issues and improved the quality and the flexibility of your camera. So we have multiple copies of it. Whenever we upgrade it, we make multiple copies just for redundancy and for sometimes, it's not an easy thing to ship around. So we need to have multiple copies so we can have back-to-back productions. But definitely, it's something that is evolving at almost every project. So whether it's we build a whole new camera or we modify the current camera, it's evolving pretty quickly.
I mean, the whole industry is evolving. Yes. As I understand it, you're kind of effectively mastering at a sort of higher, I think I even heard it's like 5K per eye kind of thing. Not that I would get that on a Gear VR, but I presume you're mastering here because, of course, by the time you finish the nomadic series, we might have a next generation or a generation after that of technology, and I guess you want to be in front of the curve.
Yeah, so I mean, it's right now we're really displaying probably a quarter of what we actually have in terms of content. That's not just a limitation of the screen, it's also a limitation of the hardware and the capacity to play back. We're mainly using the Gear VR right now, but really our content is universally compatible. But yes, very, very quickly, I think we're going to even max that out, and our future cameras, which are already in development, address that resolution problem. What's your,
I guess, mastering frame rate? Not the display rate that I might be looking at, depending on the gear, but what are you kind of mastering at?
We're mastering at 60 frames per second right now. Yeah.
And then, of course, I might have something that's at 90 hertz, and I'm going to be going up from there, right?
Yeah, so...
or 120 or whatever it is that's coming.
There's always two frame rates going on, well, always. At least in the case of the Oculus headsets, there's the refresh rate of the tracking and the refresh rate of the content. So even today, you could play our 60 frame per second content in a 90 frame per second kit, and you're going to get that 90 frames of movement, but 60 frames of playback. And, but we will be increasing frame rate as well.
So as I said at the outset, there was just an extraordinary group of people here from all aspects of animation and VFX, from Bill Reeves from Pixar to Joe Knoll from ILM to Joe Letteri from Weta. Joe was here celebrating 20 years of Weta and discussing many things. We sat down with him to talk about the tremendous work that Weta does, But I should also say that I wanted to touch base with him about the sad passing of Andrew Lesnie. Andrew was a terrific DOP, an Australian DOP who worked on so much of the great films that Weta has produced. And of course, Joe worked with him extensively over many, many years.
Yeah, it was very sad and very surprising. I mean, Andrew is in his prime of the work he's been doing. I started working with Andrew back on Lord of the Rings, and I think since then we've done, what, 8 or 9 films together? King Kong, you know, the Hobbit trilogy, Rise of the Planet of the Apes, Lovely Bones. It's been fantastic working with Andrew, because he had this amazing ability to go wide and epic, but also to bring it home with really beautiful portrait photography, you know, in the small, intimate moments. And I was always marveled at his ability to kind of keep those two worlds in balance. And it was just very, very painterly what he did. And it's just a tremendous talent that he had. And of course, I didn't get to work with him on this, but I always loved Babe, and that was a fantastic film. So yeah, it's a great loss. Yeah,
we were interviewing him one time, and I was just struck by the fact that he wanted to discuss something about the way I'd lit or set up. And he said, "Oh, do you mind if we change it?" And I said, "Absolutely." I mean, oh my God, yeah, are you kidding me? And he said, "Actually, no. What we should do is check with the cameraman, in this case, was filming it." And of course, my poor cameraman was just like white. I was like, and he said, "What do you think?" But it struck me that was indicative of a kind of respect he had for everyone for their craft. I mean, obviously he could get whatever he wanted, but he didn't presume that. He seemed just incredibly respectful of different roles.
Yeah, I mean, filmmaking is very collaborative, and as you say, you know, working with Andrew, it always felt that way. He understood what we were up against, and it was always about the bigger picture of trying to, you know, kind of serve two masters of what you needed to get that beautiful, rich live action photography, and then what would we need as a visual effects department to extend that into the unknown, you know, whether it be a character like Gollum or Kong, or, you know, a landscape that we have to build around the lighting that he's done for a particular, you know, small, intimate moment.
Because it's interesting, isn't it, that role of the DOP into that of the sort of virtual cinematography, because it's a sort of a palette that they're selecting, but of course you have to be respectful to it, but in some scenes you're completely lighting from scratch, and that must have been, I mean, since you first started working, that kind of evolved over that sort of period of time.
Yeah, I mean, we learned a lot. We just watched what Andrew, you know, was doing. We talked to him about it, and then we talked about how you would extend that into the bits that he couldn't light, because just physically there was nothing there to light. And yeah, it was just always a dialogue, and it allowed us to bridge the worlds very cleanly.
Can I run back now to when you first joined the crew in New Zealand? I'm just wondering, before you even joined, when was the first time you actually sort of heard of this crowd in New Zealand? Like, I mean, it must have been before you joined, of course, but...
Well, it was, because I was aware of the work that they were doing back on, so I was aware of the work that Weta was doing back on Contact and on Frighteners. And also, I thought Heavenly Creatures was just one of my favorite films. And so that's, you know, I started to become acquainted with Peter as a director. And then when I heard, you know, that he was doing the Hobbit trilogy, I just figured that would be a really unique perspective on it.
So when you arrived to do Twin Towers, or Two Towers, right? What was that environment like? Because I mean, you must have been able to fit nearly the entire company in what is now the lobby of the building, which is something you can't do today.
Yeah, I think we were in 2 buildings at the time, about 150 people. It was a real scramble. I arrived about 6 weeks before Fellowship was finished to start prepping for Two Towers. And just everyone was pulling out all the stops to try to get those films done. And it was an amazing amount of work being crafted by hand, you know, to get that really rich look of introducing Middle Earth to the world. And it was just a fantastic sense of artistry and camaraderie that was going on there. And of course, what I was looking to do then was to try to build that into something that we could carry on with, you know, larger and larger scope, because we knew we were going to have, you know, the big battle scenes in Two Towers, Helm's Deep, and we knew we were also going to have to create Gollum, not just a couple of, you know, glimpses that we saw in the Fellowship, which were fantastic, but his first full-on introduction and his first performance. So we were kind of hitting on those two fronts, you know, how do you create character, How do you develop something like subsurface scattering? Was subsurface scattering even going to work? That was a new idea at the time. I looked at it and thought, this is what we need to make skin work. But at the time, it hadn't been done. We were still just pursuing it. Working with Andy Serkis and looking at his performance and thinking, how do we really capture what he's done without going back and kind of having to keyframe over all of it? What's that blend that we can get between animation and an actor's performance that will make this character come alive? And so the idea of really pushing forward on motion capture as a tool, and really as a production tool, more so than just a science experiment, which is kind of what it was in those days. We turned it into full-on stage production and blended all those elements together and tried to turn it into a filmmaking experience that, for a director like Peter, could start to bridge the gap between the two worlds.
Yeah, there's an enormous amount of technology. If we look at the history of Weta, I mean, you mentioned subsurface scattering there and motion capture, but obviously there was the massive crowd stuff that then splintered off. But Gollum, I mean, the work on King Kong and the fax-based facial stuff, I mean, right up to the high frame rate stuff with the more recent material. I mean, there's just an enormous amount of stuff. Are there any of those technologies that you look back on now and they didn't catch you off guard, but you were surprised at how well they worked? That because a lot of them were just hard work, I know, to develop, but were any more of a sort of a gift than they were toil to get to?
I think the one that was most surprising was subsurface scattering. As I said, I had the intuition when I was reading, the initial papers, Henrik Jensen's papers, and seeing that this feels like the piece that's missing from what we're trying to do with realistic creatures and rendering characters and rendering skin. And it took a while to get it working and to get results, and trying to control those results in those days, because we really were just feeling our way along. Too much, too little, some happening in the wrong places, some happening in the right places. What it did to lighting, it changed your lighting in a way that as CG artists we were never used to. Having light go in one direction and come out a different one suddenly changed how you had to think about lighting. All pushing it towards more, physical realism, which was ultimately our goal. But it was kind of surprising that it kind of locked in together, that you really just got this believable sense of a living character, out of Gollum.
I remember talking to you about that time, and you were once it got working, you were so pleased with it. I think you remember saying you're just sticking on everything, the elephants, no matter what. It just seemed to be giving extra realism right through.
Yeah.
It must be good to develop tools that you can take forward. I'm wondering how much the gift of the first trilogy and the second trilogy allows you to develop those tools, because that's one of the things I really admire about Weta. You're not just solving the emergency in front of you, you're building tools for the future.
For us, the real breakthrough for building a consistent platform was really Avatar, because our brief for Avatar was so large. It wasn't actually a brief, it was build this world and everything in it. And to do that, we really had to take the time to look at all the tools we were using and to understand which ones were really valid and which ones were just, expedient, because the limitations of computer power, for example, or the limitations of even what we knew. Were we doing things just to get the work done versus were we really building a proper foundation for building a world and creating a physical basis for everything in it? And so for Avatar, we spent about a year just tearing apart every bit of technology that we had and vetting them and looking at the ones that would survive and the ones that really needed to be rethought. And that gave us a platform that we could now, anytime a project came up, we could start to refine whatever areas in the world needed special attention.
And that all sunk with this whole move towards physically based lighting, physically plausible lighting. And it seems to me increasingly every tool you develop is just referencing the real world as much as possible.
When you can reference the real world, you have something that grounds you, that you're taking away the guesswork. Because when you're creating visual effects, you have two questions. Is it right, and does it look good? And they're not always the same thing, but you want them to be as close as possible, right? And by that I mean we're always creating something that's not really right because it's not real. If you're going to have a chimp that talks, well, there's no such thing. So how close do you need to get to a real chimp? And then how much do you take liberty to make what you've created become believable? So you need those two to kind of hold together throughout the whole process.
Tell me about your view now on Manuka, because you've had a full final film to work on it. That was, again, kind of pulling apart some basic assumptions we had about how shaders worked and where they sat and the very relationship of building stuff. How's it sort of worked out?
Manuka's worked out great for us. You know, over the years, and especially starting with subsurface scattering, you start looking at algorithms that you need to describe light transport. And every piece of light transport seemed to have its own algorithm that described it better than another one. You know, for example, with subsurface scattering, you had the idea of doing, point clouds to capture their radiance. Or we came up with a spherical harmonics pipeline for Avatar to handle global illumination and lighting from IBLs. And those two things didn't necessarily play well together. When we did the first Rise of the Planet of the Apes, trying to combine subsurface scattering with spherical harmonics and IBL lighting and fur was immensely tricky, because we needed another representation of the fur that can plug into these other two representations and all work together. So artists spend a long time just balancing the strengths and weaknesses of these various approaches to keep everything looking real, and then to have some time to try to be creative and to make it look good. And it finally got to the point where I was just looking at where we could go with rendering technology, and it really seemed like, in the end, the problem you're trying to solve could be solved with path tracing. Not that we have all the answers, but the best approach we could take was to build a rendering platform that would allow us to be completely correct and physically based where possible, and to introduce whatever biases we needed to get a production done in the time frame that we had with what we didn't know or couldn't expedite. But with the goal that as we learned those, we'd be able to replace those pieces with pieces that are more and more accurate. And that's what Manuka has given us. We can look at it as a research platform. We can say, right, I really want to see ground truth, fire it up and let it run for a few days and let me see what the real answer is. Or you can turn it around and say, okay, I really got to get this shot out, in a couple of days. What can I do to maintain that look, but introduce tricks like we're all used to doing that will still allow me to maintain the proper physical sense and still get everything working.
There seem to be some unexpected advantages from Manuka. I mean, obviously, as you said, you've got this path tracing system, and it's clearly built for the future, because you're obviously going to be adding to it as you hit other projects. But for example, I was discussing with the team about how the extensive deep data pipeline that you so successfully employed on Apes and other films, and that seemed to be sort of almost falling out without a huge render cost and stuff. So there's some real advantages in going down this path, isn't there?
Yeah, the real advantage to us of the whole Manuka project is we could just think about it for years and years as we were planning it and building it. So every bit of technology that we needed, we knew had to come together in the renderer. It always does. That's the final point where no matter what you've done, the whole scene has to flow through the renderer and come out the other end. So if you're talking about how you're going to put pieces together that you might need to render in layers for whatever reasons you might need that for compositing, well, yeah, we can implement that with a deep data pipeline. That's no problem. But if you're also looking at what you're going to be doing with your creatures, if you're going to have massive fur simulations coming through, for example, for the Planet of the Apes shots, how do we deal with that much data? So the renderer was built with both physical accuracy and the ability to handle large scenes in mind. And so that way we can have multiple input streams coming into it, and they could all combine correctly.
The trouble about talking about the success of Weta over the last 20 years is it sounds terribly much like this is the end of a book, where it's just the sort of the end of this chapter, and there's obviously a whole rest of a book to go. So looking forward, what are the kind of things that you would like to see Weta doing for the next 20 years? I mean, 20 years from now seems a ridiculous amount of time, but you've got to be planning ahead for at least a decade right now.
Well, what I see happening more and more is this idea of virtual production becoming a tool that's comfortable to directors and also to crews. When Jim rolled out this idea, Jim Cameron, when we were doing Avatar, this was a big deal, the idea that you're going to shoot this whole movie, virtually, or large chunks of it, and bridge that divide between virtual filmmaking and live action filmmaking. But you can see, for example, on the Hobbit films, Peter really took it to heart. When we got to the end of Desolation and Smog, there was a scene that where the dwarves are trapping Smog inside the old forges where they relight the fires. Well, Peter shot that knowing what he wanted Smog to do, but just getting the green screens of the dwarf, actors for live action photography. And then he had our previs team, Dave Clayton and his team just put together lots of animation to block out all the action that these guys did. And they roughed it out and then they refined it, and Peter put cameras on it, and he built the whole scene from that, going from what he shot on green screen to these completely virtual shots. And that experience worked out so well for him and for us that he really embraced that when we came to do the Battle of the Five Armies. So Peter spent a lot of time on the virtual stage with stunt performers, with our big, virtual landscape for the battle scene, and with his virtual camera, and just went in there and, minutes-long animation takes with dozens of performers and thousands of background, characters were just available to him to put a camera on and fly it around and bang out his shots and work out what he wanted. Sent them up to editorials, get a cut going, look at what was missing, go back and reshoot it. We had this whole process. We were just constantly looping through between visual effects shots and previs and stage. Those barriers have just fallen, so it's no longer a linear process of shoot something, hand it over to visual effects, they'll put in the missing bits, and you're done. Now it's we start shooting in visual effects, and then we loop back to live action, and then we come back and do a little more previs and work that into the scene. And so it's all a kind of a big two-way street now. It's a great community. We've got somewhere around 1,200 people now at Weta, and our core team has been with us ever since Rings. We've got people that have been there for 15 years, and it's great, especially as we branch out to more and more films, because we can keep that knowledge and that consistency, so that if we're doing, for example, Planet of the Apes with Dan Lemon supervising, or we're doing Hobbit and you've got Eric Sandin supervising, everyone is talking. We're using consistent techniques. We're looking at what's working. We were developing Manuka with Hobbit in mind, but we got it ready in time to start testing it for Apes, and Dan picked it up and his crew started using it, and it gave it the real battle testing that it needed, but it also turned out that it helped us get through some shots that would have been really difficult to do any other way. And it's that sense that everyone is working together that really allows these ideas to keep flowing.
Well, congratulations on where Weta's got to after 20 years. I'm certainly looking forward to the next 20 years, and thanks for taking time to talk to us.
All right, thanks, Mike.
Well, that's it from FMX, an amazing conference. We want to thank the organisers here so much for being so generous in looking after us and helping us do stuff. FMX 2015, it's been a great conference. If you get a chance to go to 2016, you should definitely do it. It's one of the best conferences in the world, set here in marvellous Germany. I'm Mike Seymour. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Mike. And don't forget to follow us on Twitter, FX Guide News, or on Facebook. Until next time, see ya. For more industry news, in-depth features, podcasts and forums, check out fxguide.com. And for visual effects training, check out fxphd.com.